Hi everybody. In this VRender video, we're going to take a look at some common beginner mistakes in Lumion. We're going to look at Lumion 2023, and I'll talk about the most common issues that I see with new Lumion users and issues that I've seen with my own Lumion students. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, everybody, here we are in the just default Lumion environment. You'll notice we're using the Lumion Student Edition. This is because Lumion is one of the softwares that our school, or my school, uses. And it's pretty cool that Lumion provides some really an educational version for free. It's absolutely great for students and new learners. Let's click on the bottom right here with the little gears icon. And this is super, super important, and it's really often forgotten about. You can drop the quality of the editor and the resolution. Now, as far as I'm aware, the editor resolution is using AMD's upscaling technology, but all in all, looks really, really good. Now, in addition, we have a couple of other options here. We can turn high-quality trees on or off. Now, I generally recommend we turn these off when you're in the editor because it's going to speed things up. Now, they will render at the correct resolution, but there's no real need. If you're kind of familiar with Lumion, you kind of know how good the foliage is. You don't really need to see these in full high definition when you're placing trees. In addition, we've got a few other options that we can change here as well. More specifically, make sure that recovery is turned on. Lumion is very, very, very stable, especially compared to some other rendering programs out there. But when something does go wrong, you do want to make sure that you've got recovery turned on. And that means Lumion will try and find a recovery file for you. That's pretty nice. Okay, everyone. So on to the next thing. This is the model that we're going to use for our sort of test scene. And you can see it is a tiny home build. This is from the SketchUp warehouse. And this comes from SCG Official. And it's a really lovely model. So this is what we're going to use as our test scene. Now, the second beginner mistake that I see that's quite common actually pertains to this, the Lumion Live Sync. Now, you can manually import your content into Lumion, and a lot of people do. However, if you're using SketchUp or some of the other major 3D modeling programs out there, you should look into the Lumion Live Sync. This is going to send over your content directly to Lumion. Let's click right here. And just like that, here's your model in Lumion. Now, one thing to note about using the Lumion Live Sync, I do strongly recommend that you turn off camera synchronization. It used to be that for some reason, the camera sync would actually use a huge amount of resources. You may have a better performance just by turning this off. Quite simply, nothing is going to ruin your render quite like seeing this infinite horizon right here. It just really kills the shot. And you see this quite a lot in really beginner users and beginner sort of ArcViz artists, is that they'll just have their building or whatever it is, their home, building, whatever they're working on, a commercial property, and it just exists in a vacuum. Now, it might be beautifully lit and have great materials, but you can see effectively there's no feeling of grounding. Now, how do we fix that? Well, my go-to, and this is what I get my students to do pretty much from the off, is to bring in a background. So this one right here, you can find this in the warehouse. I've mentioned him before. This is Max Akovsky. And he actually is, I believe, an architect, but he has a number of really wonderful backgrounds that you can just drop right into your scene. Now, I've used this background number 18. It's a perfectly circular environment. And if we actually look at it in SketchUp, it's quite large. So one thing we might actually have to do is scale it down. Now, honestly, I think this is actually okay because I'd rather have the background be too large and then we can scale it manually. I think circular environments also read a lot better than trying to find one that is just perfectly straight. Now, I'm going to tap up on the keyboard and drag this guy down, and we want to make sure it crashes a little bit into the green line on basically the green axis here. And I think all in all, We just want to double check the scale, but that's a pretty good starting point. Let's go to Lumion and take a quick look at that. All right, there we go. Now, please note that, it's not perfect and we have to do a lot to blend this. But all in all, that is a better horizon skyline than using the default, really just infinite horizon. All right, let's move on. Now, for this, I have replaced what was a pretty good roof design with this really terrible one, and I'll show you why. Oftentimes, when it comes to roofing in particular, I'll see new users select the roof, then go materials, and oh, here's a slate roof material, and we just assign it and go, all right, good enough. Now, there is obviously a bit of an issue here, and it is actually to do with effectively really the lack of UV directionality. So Lumion is effectively guessing which way the material should go. And you can see now, maybe we're like, okay, I can just double click on this and we can go down to, rotating and just start spinning this kind of material to get what we want. But it's not going to work. No matter what you do, effectively, this is not pointing the correct way. And so this happens quite a lot. And unfortunately, the only fix that I can think of is going back here to SketchUp, and we need to make sure that these two roof areas actually have different materials assigned to them. Now, to the best of my knowledge, it doesn't make any difference whether you assign a random color or you actually assign a specific material texture like these and then send it back over. However, once you send it back over, you'll have the ability to independently assign that same roofing material to two different sections of the roof. So now what I can do is click on this, go to materials and assign this one. And I'm going to be able to rotate this independently. And so I can actually come in here and I can adjust the actual pitch. Now, be very mindful, some of the tile materials you can see, they do have directionality built into the actual texture. And there we go. That looks pretty nice. Now I can go up to the top left, go copy, right click here, and I'm just going to paste this in. All right, and you can see now if I wanted, for example, to change the direction of this one, we can adjust it separately. It's a small thing, but it really will ruin kind of the overall look and feel of your models if the tiling is basically done incorrectly. All right, everybody. The next thing I want to talk about is landscape and grass. You can kind of see here the Lumion default starting plane. This is just a standard, plane environment. It's just unrealistically flat. And it's really worthwhile going to the landscape tab right over here and clicking on height. Now, I usually try and get students to do this early on. Just go in here and add variations. So to do this, we're going to make the brush size quite high. And we're also going to crank up the speed a little bit. And so you can see here, you're getting a very large kind of brush area. And if we left click, we're adding basically height variations in the landscape. Now, you may find that this is maybe a little too sensitive. You can kind of see just holding your mouse down, it can be a little bit too sensitive. And so you can always hit the flatten landscape button here, which will bring it back. But overall, I think this will work pretty nicely. If you think of it as thinking about it in terms of big to small, so we're going to make some much larger kind of landscape changes in the background, and then these will become a little bit less pronounced the closer we actually get to our model. And that one over there on the left might be a little bit high. You can always grab the smooth. They're calling it smoothen, not really sure why, but it's really just a smooth brush. So I'm going to left click and drag this down. You can also add in a little bit of jitter. So jitter is effectively just going to randomize the effect. So if I pull up my camera here and I left click and hold it down, you can see what the jitter brush is actually doing. It's the jitter is actually a really clever way to introduce more irregularities in your landscape. When it comes to doing stuff like this, we do tend to sort of make it what we think the landscape should look like, but in reality, the landscape is probably a lot more undulating and a lot more variable than we would normally do. So just be mindful of that. It should look natural, but it also should not look artificially sculpted. All right, moving on. The next thing I want to mention and talk about is grass. So there are a number of different ways to really use grass in your Lumion scenes. Now, the first way is if, for example, you have a surface like this, we can click on it, go to materials. I'm going to go to landscape and turn on grass. Now, please note, you've got this flat 2D grass, which is going to look a little bit like this. Can be very useful if you're working on a scene really where the camera is not going to be very close to the actual grass. From distance, you can kind of see, and I think it looks okay from distance. Up close, this 2D grass material is really not much better than the actual landscape without grass turned on. Now, the other option is to put 3D grass on. And so I'm going to select this, and again, you can see here. Now, the 3D grass will look really good, again, in certain circumstances. It does, however, add a huge amount of polys to your scene. In fact, it can be really cost prohibitive to do this. And so I'd probably, in terms of, return on investment, do this if the camera is going to be very close. So for example, if our little home here had an actual sort of manicured garden and you're trying to show that off, then yeah, you would probably get away with putting this on right here. What we want to do for this shot, though, is to use the landscape grass. So I'm going to move myself just out of the way here, and we'll click accept on any changes and move myself back. And to do this, firstly, again, just like sculpting the landscape, think of it as big to small. So I'm going to find really an environment that I kind of like the look of. And if you think of it as this, each of these landscapes is effectively almost like a sort of biome. It comes with its own sort of material palette, which will be these guys right down at the bottom left. And so you can see, you can really pick and choose the environment that you want. Now, I'm going to find something. Let's just do this grass. Let's maybe do farmland, and we'll just see if we can find something that we like. All right. Well, yeah, let's do grass too. Now, what's really, really cool about this, if we go to landscape grass here and we toggle this on, you can see that the procedural landscape grass is actually going to pick its color information from the environment that you pick. And I think this is really, really cool. You can get a pretty nice look, even just turning this 3D grass on this landscape grass. Now, a couple of things to note about this, though. In terms of performance hit, this one, I believe, is going to be probably the worst of all. And that's due to a specific reason. The landscape grass, by toggling this guy on and off, it is going to be tied to whichever texture has this little like grass icon to it. Now, because this texture is everywhere on my scene, it's all over, then this means that this grass effect is being done everywhere. The next point I want to make in terms of beginner mistakes is not using other external assets. Now, Lumion does come with some pretty good objects. Its foliage library is, I'm going to say, probably the best out there. Now, one area it does fall short is in some additional models. You can see here on the right, we have a Lumion rock, and you can see on the left, we've got one that we brought in from Quixel. And you can kind of see the fidelity difference right there. These rocks are just effectively, they're low poly models, but they're also low resolution textures. In fact, judging by this, you can see the Quixel one is set to, I believe, 4K. I really think this rock here is honestly, it looks like, 1K by 1K or even lower. It's pretty low resolution. Okay, so my point here is don't be afraid to bring in assets from outside. It's actually pretty easy. Just go to imported models, click place, and import your new model. Now, Lumion will take quite a lot of different file types for this, which is really kind of cool. But please note that when you bring in models like this, you are going to have to set up the textures. Now, strictly speaking, the Quixel Megascans is available for really Twinmotion users. Quixel is owned by Epic, and as such, you can sign in with your Epic account or something similar. It was really only sort of intended for use in the really sort of the Epic biome, so like Twinmotion, Unreal. But right now, there really is nothing stopping users from downloading them and loading those assets into Lumion. And I kind of do hope that that continues. I think it's really great to make really amazing selections of content available to a wider audience. It also makes getting into 3D a lot easier for people because there's so much more pre-made stuff. So my argument is, you know, as long as it's technically kind of open to use, I say use it. I think bringing in models from outside really, really benefits Lumion. And overall, well, if we actually go look at this sort of in the rendered mode or the preview/photo mode, and again, I've got a pretty basic lighting setup here, you can kind of see the imported content is going to look a bit better. Now, I need to be very clear on this. When you are importing models into Lumion, obviously, the more you bring in, the sort of like the more resources they're going to hog. And bringing in a lot of 4K objects is going to slow things down dramatically. And so just be mindful. The question then is, where do you use these, you know, higher or better quality models? And really it comes down to like where they're placed in the camera. If this is going to be close to the camera, get the high quality model. If it's going to be like a rock just placed way back here, then no, don't use it. Just stick with the Lumion default environment tabs. All right, everybody, the next thing I want to talk about is trees and tree placement and common beginner mistakes. So Lumion has, I think, just the most incredible tree library. I think it's absolutely, absolutely brilliant. It's why, at least in my classes, I make my students use Lumion for exterior shots. You know, even though the path tracer is its own kind of issue, or at least ray tracing Lumion, for exterior shots, the tree foliage library is just so utterly brilliant. And I think it just looks great. Now, problem is placing of trees. Now, say, for example, in this shot, we know we want it to be in a broadleaf type environment. And, you know, we want to maybe add a lot of different oaks and things like that. One issue I see with new Twinmotion users is sort of the arrangement of objects. And so it'll be like, I need a tree. Okay, so I have tree, and then I have other tree, and I have more tree, and I have tree, and I have tree. And then the assumption that, like, that's good, right? I've got trees in the background, right? And what could possibly be wrong with that? And you can kind of see it right there. This makes sense from a kind of a beginner point of view, because you think that's sort of how things should be arranged. But the problem is a couple of features here. You know, firstly, you're using the same tree again and again. And yeah, this is a great tree model, but repetition, it just doesn't appear to this level in nature. And it looks wrong, whether people will be able to tell you why it's wrong. The second issue is the actual placement. It's really hard for people to try and place objects and scatter them randomly without looking like they're not random. In other words, our attempt at making something look random just generally doesn't look right. Whether we're aware of it or not, we still put in sort of patterns in our, you know, our placement of objects. And so how do we get around that? Well, there's a couple of things we can do. Let's move over here to the left. And so when it comes to the placement of trees, you can try using cluster. Cluster is a really kind of clever way to basically, you know, well, just drop objects into the scene. You can see when I move my mouse over here and I've got it set to cluster placement, it allows me to add basically clusters. Now, I think it looks good, but the technique that I'm going to recommend is actually going to be the mass placement tool. Now, this is one that I, for the longest time, just did not use, and I really should have been using it. I think it's really clever. It just takes a little bit more effort than just going cluster, cluster, or randomly placing trees. So what we do is, I'm going to pick a number of trees here that I actually like. So I'm going to click on this cherry bark oak. I'm going to add that. And then I'm going to maybe find just something else in here. Let's just do I'm going to do something slightly different as well. Let's do this big leaf maple. And I'm going to add, click on this guy right here, this big one. And we're going to go add. And then I'm going to add another one, which is going to be this one here. So let's go in here and replace, make sure. All right, now I've got 4 different trees what I need to do is just left click and drag, and you can see I've got pretty much the area that this is going to be placed on. And then I'm going to release my mouse, so left click there, there we go. Now, in and of itself, that doesn't look great, and it definitely doesn't look random. So we need to increase the number of items. You can see I'm at like about 23. Okay, great. We also need to ensure place on ground is pressed, which is great. We need to randomize the direction, randomize spacing along the line, and this is the really important one, randomize offset. And so if I grab this, you can see now I'm basically turning this into a more organic arrangement. And by the way, you will notice as I move my camera back, the trees kind of do get lower fidelity. That is, I think, because we have turned on or turned off show trees in high res in the settings, which again, you do want to do that. Okay, but even just looking at this now, like that is a far more natural and organic looking arrangement of objects than you'd get by just placing it by hand. Mass placement is just really, really good. It's just really useful. I think overall, I think it just looks really, really great. And you can continue to just, you know, add content and just replace it. It's so easy to work with, and the results are a lot more natural, especially for something like this when, you know, you're going to be seeing, if I put my camera back here, you are going to be seeing kind of quite a bit behind the actual build. And even if it's out of focus, and even if it's maybe you got a little bit of like light coming through the trees or a little bit of fog, you still want it to look more natural, and don't do it by hand. Now, when you get closer to the building, so for example, this tree right here or one right here, yeah, that's when you can probably get into placing them more artistically, you know, trying to make it frame the scene a little bit better. But generally speaking, placing trees by hand and expecting them to look random just isn't going to work. All right, let's move on. All right, everybody. The next thing I see beginners do in Lumion a lot is, again, sort of keeping within the theme of foliage, it's to do with the use of plants, more specifically the flowering plants. So as much as I love the foliage library within Lumion, the one area that it falls really down on, I think, is the use of really just these models for actual plants. They're just not great. Now, some of them are really nice, right? Like this guy here, this balsam, that's really, really, really nice. But some of the other ones just haven't aged very well. So for example, looking at this guy right here, let's place this little one here. Yeah, I don't think that's up to the standard, honestly, of a lot of foliage in other rendering engines right now. My advice to beginner students when it comes to Lumion is basically steer clear of this section right here. The flowering plants, they can work well if you go through, pick ones that are really nice, and maybe just add those sort of to, like, you know, your favorites. But for the most part, a lot of these I don't think are going to look great. And oftentimes the colors are so bright and so vivid that it actually ends up taking away from your shot. So, you know, for new users, I would say maybe don't use these flowers. If you made it to this point in the video, thank you so much for watching. Really do appreciate it, and really appreciate the comments and people clicking the little like button. It's been really great to hear from, you know, viewers who watch the channel say how much they appreciate the content and how much they've learned from it. So, yay! Thank you so much, and I'll keep making it as long as people are interested. And the last thing I want to do is take a look at the FX stack. Now, the common student mistake is to basically just turn on tons of the FX effects and just hope that it makes the image look better. So I'm going to run through here the sort of effect stack that I generally advise my students to use. I think it's kind of a good catch-all for most exterior shots, and overall it'll get you kind of most of the way there. All right, the first thing we do, turn on shadows. Now I'm going to crank the shadows to the exterior, which I believe adds a little bit of blue in there. I'm going to crank Omni Shadow as well and force shadows back into some of the occluded areas. Now, the other important one here is I'm going to turn off coloring, is brightness. Now, this is going to literally determine the basically how dark the shadows are. And by default, it is set to a pretty low value. If I double click here, reset, we can go back. And you can see this is probably kind of where you actually want to keep it. This or even lower. Take it down a little bit. So those are the main shadow settings. Shadow correction, crank that all the way up, and we leave the shadows on normal. All right, that was pretty good. Skylight, we will turn on, and I'm going to put the render quality just back to normal here. When you do go to export this, please put this up to ultra, and please turn on both of these. This will just, they're like the make pretty button. Now, in saying that, they are very, very resource intensive. So only turn those on at the very end. The overall skylight is actually going to crank up the blue light in your scene. So you can try taking that up a little bit too. I think that will look pretty nice. Okay, hyperlight we do turn on. This is a very much on a per image basis. Hyperlight is going to shove light into the darker areas of your scene. It's basically a pseudo sort of slight attempt at global illumination. Now, global illumination is actually gone from Lumion 2023. It's completely sort of discontinued. But hyperlight sort of mimics that effect, and cranking it up will blast light into some of the darker areas of your scene. Okay, I'm going to turn on reflections. I have 3 active reflection planes here. And reflection planes, again, you know, just sort of as a user base, generally reflective surfaces and flat surfaces will take reflection planes. All right, looks good. Color correction. Now, I don't have sort of the time to go through all of this for this image, but overall, you do have a lot more control over the actual sort of lighting of your scene. Now, for the exterior shots, I'm going to leave auto exposure on and really just let Lumion figure out really how light and how dark everything should be and where the midtones should be. But you do have more control. If you want to go in manually, we can take that a little to the left. For example, taking the temperature will bring in a lot more blue into the image. So I'm going to move that a little bit to the left. Looks good. Sharpen, you do want to put on, and I prefer to crank this all the way. I think one of the ways that you can mitigate the sort of cartoony look of Lumion renders is to crank that sharpness all the way. All right, real skies, this is just a given. I'm not going to go into this. Just a standard real sky that I like the look of. There we go. That'll work. Now, precipitation. In order to do this correctly, we've gone into precipitation, and we do like having these reflections on the ground plane. I think it really helps sell the environment, and it just makes your building look grounded. So a couple of things here. I've turned almost everything off. I don't need, for example, extra fog. We're going to add that in ourselves. And the main thing is just picking the precipitation phase. And so you can see if we take this all the way to about here, we get a nice wet look. I think that looks pretty nice. Now, turn everything else off. Layer visibility. This is just there so you can hide the trees. And you can see the effect that has. Really, really cool feature. So going forward, if we like the look of our shot right here, let's turn off all the trees. That will speed up performance. All right, great. Now, bleach and bloom, I think, are absolutely musts. Bleach is going to basically desaturate the image. And you can see if we crank it all the way, that's sort of the effect that it has. I really like this as an FX to use. I think it strips away some of the, again, that cartoony, overly saturated look that comes with Lumion renders. The second one is a little bit of bloom. And I think, again, bloom, if you crank it all the way, you can see what it does, kind of overexposing certain areas of the shot. Now, this, again, I still think just add a little dash. It'll go a long way with your images. I think, okay, that's looking pretty nice. We got a couple of other things that we should add to the shot as well. And clicking on FX, it is great that you've got a whole bunch of some of the more common FX stat. We are going to add 2-point perspective as well. You can see the effect that will have. And all right, the next thing then is we're going to add a little bit of basically fog. And we're looking to do that really just because we kind of want to haze out the sort of the area at the back where the trees are. I don't want that in full fidelity. So crank up the fog density, and the fall off is going to determine effectively the height of the fog. Now, I don't want this to be obviously in the sky, so you're going to drop it. Basically, cranking the slider will drop the brightness, or sorry, the height of that fog. And then we can drop down the actual density here. You can kind of see we're going for a nice haze effect. And you can also tweak the brightness. I mean, I don't really, feel like there'd be much need for this. I think I'd just generally leave this where it is. But overall, pretty happy. Might dial it back just a little dash. You want it to affect the back of the image back here, but I don't really want it hitting the actual house itself. And so we can see here, there's going to be a fine line just to get this where we need it to be. Okay, I think that'll work well. All right, all in all then, just a couple more things that we might want to do. Go to camera. We are going to turn on depth of field. And with the depth of field, what I recommend to my students is just crank the background slider all the way and then super crank it. And this will really give you an idea of where the effect is actually coming into play. And then we slowly start dialing this back. Now we can fine tune it with the actual focus distance. But again, something like that will look pretty good. Again, we're sort of eyeballing it a little bit. All right, let's turn back on our layers and we'll just see how this is going to go. Yeah. I'm overall pretty happy with that. There's some other tweaks we could do. We could add chromatic aberration. We could also as well go into the, back to the here and look for, I'm looking for the autumn colors. There we go. Click on this and click on the yellow just to see if we want to add a little bit more to our image. I think that looks really nice as is. Okay. One last thing you might want to be aware of is just the focal length. Now, general recommendations that I talk about in a couple of my videos is for exterior shots, kind of starting at 15 is a really good range, but you can see because of how far away our kind of camera is from this shot, I do think we might want to crank this a little bit higher. So let's bring that up. About there might work nicely. Again, this is done on a per image basis. Okay, all in all, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found this guide for beginner Lumion user mistakes to be useful. All right, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.